Very good afternoon from a fairly cloudy, overcast London. A very good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on your time zone. We see, just looking at the chat, others are in London, Ghana, Kazakhstan. Indeed, I was in Almaty myself a few weeks ago. Lovely country, but gets very cold in winter, far colder than the UK. So a very warm welcome, prospective online career accelerator at Superstars, and thank you very much for joining at this session. Just as the very brief introduction while people are joining and saying where they are from in the world, my name is James Abdi, James Abdi. I am an associate professor in the Department of Statistics at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Many people forget the addendum there of the and political science. Why am I speaking to you today? Well, I serve as one of the course conveners on the amazing online career accelerator in data analytics created by the London School of Economics and Political Science in collaboration with Fourth Rev. And indeed, my thanks to the Fourth Rev team for arranging today's session. Now, in my briefing notes, I've been informed that many of you clearly have been considering enrolling on the Data Analytics Online Career Accelerator. I suspect there's some variation among you about to what extent you have officially enrolled. Some of you are perhaps still contemplating whether this is the right thing for you. And to help you make the right decision, you've been invited to a selection of skills sessions, I believe others in Excel and Tableau. The third in the series is indeed with me, when we're going to have a little look at sort of a time series analysis and forecasting. So just a little bit on the logistics for this session. We have about an hour scheduled in. So I'm going to begin with a brief presentation about what we mean by sort of time series data and forecasting. We're then going to see some live demonstrations of how we could potentially create some forecasts in practice. And we will very much leave some time towards the end for some Q&A. Now, I'm sure you are all Zoom pros by this stage. Note, we are in January 2024, so it's almost 4 years since the lockdowns were spreading around the world. That perhaps doesn't seem that long ago now. And in that time, I'm sure you've become Zoom experts. So there is a dedicated Q&A forum feature within this webinar session. Please do use that and upvote accordingly. And as much as time permits towards the end, I'll aim to cover as many of those questions as possible. So as you'll perhaps see in the latest chat feature, indeed, the recording and slides of the session will be shared with you post the event. Also, to incentivize you to stay to the bitter end, I've got some good news, people. There is a special offer for all those attending live, and I will reveal details about what that special offer is at the very end of this session. Now, I am biased, but I promise you this is a really excellent special offer. Note, though, I did say I was biased, and I'll perhaps explain why I was biased when I reveal what that offer is. But it's nothing but good news today. Okay, so let's get stuck straight in. I think everyone has now joined and settled into the session. So let's do the obligatory screen share. Let's go on to here and just let this load for you. So as I said, I'm an associate professor in statistics at the LSE. Indeed, I completed my PhD at LSE X years ago. I'll let you be judge and jury to estimate what that numerical value of X is. And it's been a great pleasure to be involved with the online career accelerator since it first launched in, I think, January 2022. Gosh, 2 years ago now, filling a critical need and demand for many people, typically working professionals, who recognize the need to sort of reskill and upskill for the digital and indeed data era. So I've titled this session Forecasting the Future. I think it was Henry, if I was reading and paying attention in the chat, where are you from? Henry is from the future. Well, thank you very much for time traveling and hence back in time to join us in the present for this session. So forecasting the future with some uncertainty, of course. So I have to give the legal disclaimer that I need to calibrate your expectations correctly. Please do not think that after this 60-minute session, you'll be able to forecast the future perfectly. Sadly, no one has this sort of magical crystal ball in order to know exactly what's going to happen. Now, some people, of course, may claim that if typically or nearly all forecasts are wrong, why bother forecasting at all? And I would give as my counter argument to this, well, I recognize forecasts are uncertain, and hence it is right and proper that we attach some error bars to our forecasts. And I'll show you one perhaps visual way of doing that in this session. But it's better than doing nothing, because if we don't forecast, we are effectively operating blindly. So there will be uncertainty with our forecasting. So let's go on to the next slide. There we go. So our learning outcomes, of course, whenever we teach students stuff, we need to tell them what they're going to be learning. And hopefully, after this session, you will recall the terminology of forecasting, in that there's quite a specific vocabulary that we use in the field of forecasting, and I'll make you aware of it. The classification of different forecasting models. So clearly we have very limited time, unfortunately, so we'll just sort of scratch the surface at some quick and easy, which are clearly good things, advantages of those particular forecasting models, and just outline different ways in which we may perform that classification. We're going to explore some actual time series data, some synthetic, some actual real data, and I'll show you how we could decompose, so literally break down a time series variable into its so-called trend and seasonal components. Broadly, the trend looking at the long-run behavior of a series, and then the seasonal effects. More on that in a moment. We'll see how we could build some simple forecasting models. I stress the word simple there, and other things equal, we value simplicity over complexity. But other things are not necessarily always equal. And in matters of decision making, and you'll see this a lot in the Online Career Accelerator, when trying to model different kinds of data problems, there's never necessarily a single right answer. There are different possible answers, and we need to be mindful about what the trade-offs are between. There will be benefits and there will be costs, not necessarily monetary costs, albeit they may be in monetary form. What the trade-off is between is typically objective, but the weights or the importance we may place on the respective benefits and costs, those are potentially subjective. But other things equal, we would value this simplicity over complexity. And especially in matters of forecasting, well, or in model use more generally, if you're going to use a model, you want some sense about how good that model is. Now, whenever you have a choice of things in life, one would always typically choose the best option available. Now, if we want the best of something, may sound straightforward, but we do need to qualify in what sense something is the best. So, of course, that depends very much on the application of the problem. And in matters of forecasting, we might wish to judge best in terms of the so-called predictive accuracy. And I'll show you some common metrics, so common, hence widely used, and how we might judge the performance of one modeling technique over another. So, forecast. Well, what is a forecast? It is an estimate of a variable's value at some time period in the future. So with regards to this session, clearly we're going to focus on the quantitative type of forecasting, whereby we want to come up with the so-called expected value of a variable at some future time point. Now, I'm going to make a bold assumption here that many of you perhaps studied a degree once upon a time. Many of you would likely have studied at least a basic quantitative methods course, or might have had a different name at your specific university. But you may have encountered the idea of an expectation. Of course, this is not confined to things like statistics. We'll see it in the world of economics as well. For example, expectations of inflation and by extension of interest rates. More on that in a moment. So we're looking at a numerical expectation. As we said, though, all forecasts are uncertain. The future hasn't happened yet. Clearly, time is continuous. It keeps on progressing. And sooner or later, the future becomes the present and, in due course, the past. But we're trying to make an assessment today about some future time point. And until that future time point has actually occurred, we can't say with certainty what the value of this variable may be. So within the Online Career Accelerator itself, clearly it's very heavy on skills acquisition. Clearly, though, there will be a few formulae and equations throughout the 6-month program, albeit we do try to stress the practical applications of all of the theoretical things that you learn. So just formally, we can talk about some variable x. Clearly, it seems somewhat abstract at this stage. So what might examples of x be? Sales, for example, or exchange rates, or oil price, or whatever. And with a time series variable, in matters of analysis, these do need to be equidistant points in time. That means the frequency with which we collect the data is constant. So maybe we're looking at daily data, maybe weekly, quarterly, annual. So as long as they are recorded at these regular time intervals, then we would have a time series variable. So some examples. Now, of course, I suspect you're coming from various fields of endeavor in terms of your, many of you are perhaps working professionals already. In the field of business, we might be looking at maybe sales, I mentioned at quite a generic level there, maybe customer retention, customer acquisition, also demand for the product or service that you are selling. So who might be interested in doing forecasts in this instance? Perhaps yourselves, or maybe your managers. Maybe you are the ones or will be the ones after successful completion of the Online Career Accelerator, creating the forecasts on behalf of your managers with, of course, those requisite error bars. So it might be firms, competitors of firms, maybe equity analysts, maybe at, let's say, an investment bank. An equity analyst is covering a particular sector or industry, and clearly they'll be making forecasts about where they think the share price of a publicly listed company is going to go. Is company X a buy, a hold, or a sell? Of course, they are forming expectations about the future. If it's I think Tesla, for example, just lost the #1 spot in China for electric vehicles in December 2023. I think it's BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle company. So just that loss of that #1 position of Tesla. So is that a blip, or is this now going to be a longer-term trend about who's going to be the dominant player in the EV market in China, and by extension, perhaps the other wider world? So equity analysts may be trying to forecast, maybe not the share price directly, but rather forecasting demand for a company's products, and in turn, of course, the share price, which is itself a forward-looking sort of predictor about, let's say, the dividend stream or expected dividend stream of a particular company. And so the share price or fluctuations in it will clearly depend on expectations of demand. Uses there: inventory control, sales targets, performance. Goodness me, I suspect some of you, if you are currently in employment, maybe, depending on your role, perhaps part of your remuneration is target or performance based. And clearly, the setting of targets, if it's your pay, and if you're hitting the target or not, are you going to get this bonus or not? So, of course, targets, performance targets, they need to be perhaps set to stretch the individual, but they also need to be attainable. If they are wholly unrealistic, then that's unfair on the person for whom the remuneration may be based. Macroeconomics, love this one. Inflation, unemployment, GDP, interest rates. Now, I'm sure all of you will be or have been concerned in the recent months and years about inflation. Now, it's been a global problem. Clearly, some countries have been more affected by inflation than others. And by extension, the interest rates, literally the cost of borrowing for consumers. So if you have credit cards, mortgages, loans, maybe student loans, they're all going to be, or the cost of servicing those loans, linked back to the central bank base rate in your respective country. And those interest rates themselves will depend on the expectations of inflation going forward. And I'm sure you've all noticed in your respective parts of the world how interest rates on things like mortgages, how they have changed over the last few months and years in response to the changes in inflation. So I think that's something which really concerns everyone, at your personal financial level, as much as for the economists and governments around the world. In finance, foreign exchange, share prices, commodity prices, etc. Now, that was not an exhaustive list by any means, but just to give you a sense of some real-world variables, which clearly we have an observed value today, but almost certainly that will change and vary over time. So, forecasting versus prediction. I spoke about vocabulary and how we have quite a precise use of vocabulary in an analytics world. So what is forecasting itself? It's using data, and inevitably all data we possess is from the past, arguably up to and including the present moment in time. Clearly the future hasn't happened yet, and so we have no data on the future at the moment. So with the simple forecasting techniques, which we're going to see live in action shortly, we can think of these as so-called extrapolative techniques. Namely, we're looking at the past to try to predict the future. However, clearly, the past is rarely a perfect predictor of the future. Now, I always like to give analogies in my teaching about how to conceptualize things. So I'm going to, again, make an assumption that many of you have a driving license and you've driven a car, or at the very least, you've been a passenger in a car. So either you're in the driving seat or you are in the passenger seat in the front row of the car. So when you are in a car traveling along a road, you're going to be, and especially if you're the driver, you are going to be looking out of the front window, what we'll call the windscreen in the UK. I mean, that's called different things in different countries. But you're going to be looking forward. That's basically you looking into the future because you are looking at the road ahead. And clearly, if you are the driver, you clearly should be paying attention on where the car is headed. As you peer out of the windscreen, this represents the future, as in the car will reach those points you are seeing in a few seconds' time, clearly depending on the speed you are traveling at. But when you're looking ahead, you are looking for hazards, perhaps other vehicles on the road, if it's an urban area, possible pedestrians who may step into the road. And if you see these things in advance, hopefully you take preemptive action to anticipate those likely hazards. If you see there's a traffic jam ahead, of course, you should be easing off the accelerator, putting on the brake and slowing down in anticipation of it. So when you drive a car, you are looking out of the front window and you are looking into the future. Now, with these extrapolative forecasting techniques, I want you to imagine you're now driving your car. The car is moving in a forwards direction, but you are looking out of the rear window. So effectively, you are turning your body 180 degrees, looking out of the rear window, even though the car is traveling in a forward direction. Because when you look out of the rear window, you are seeing the past, where the car has been. And these extrapolative techniques are effectively like that. We are looking at the past data and really extrapolating that and assuming that what happened in the past continues into the future. Clearly, it may not. If the road has been dead straight for the last 10 miles or kilometers, in an extrapolative sense, we would be assuming that the road continues to be dead straight going forwards. And of course, it may be. But perhaps there's a sharp bend in the road ahead. Maybe we're heading towards a cliff edge. So one should be mindful And we have the benefit of simplicity with these extrapolative techniques. However, a potential downside is that the past is not guaranteed to continue in an unchanged way into the future. So within, especially course 3 of the Online Career Accelerator, you'll be introduced to topics that we will call regression and other statistical methods. So you get to look into these things in far more granular detail than we have time for today. So many, not all, but many forecasting techniques will be based on regression and similar kinds of sort of statistical models. Now, a forecast is scientific and it is based on data analysis and calculations. In contrast, a prediction, now, this is where the lay person in the real world may just use forecasts and predictions sort of synonymously. However, there is a subtle but important difference. A prediction can be done by anyone and everyone. These will be forward-looking statements based on judgment, our gut instinct, or any other kind of arbitrary methods, either with or without data. For example, I always like to relate things to the real world. In the US, there's a presidential election coming up in November. I was looking at the news this morning. Ron DeSantis has dropped out of the Republican race. It's now, I think, between Trump and Haley to get the Republican nomination. Now, you yourselves, depending how closely you are following that nomination battle, you can make your own prediction about who's going to get the Republican nomination and ultimately who's going to win the presidential election come early November. Now, that's likely to be based on your gut instinct, maybe some biases about who or which team, Democrats or Republicans, you would prefer to win. The weather. When you look at the weather, you are looking up a weather forecast rather than a weather prediction, because clearly the weather forecasts are scientific, based on data, satellites, and the meteorology more generally. So anyone can make a prediction, but we are more concerned on forecasts, which are taking sort of the biases out from which otherwise would be a simple prediction. Now, spoke about classifying forecasting models. So depending what you're trying to forecast, there's clearly the time frame over which you would wish to make those forecasts will be sensitive to that variable. If we think about staple food sales, like fruit and vegetables, for example, what would we then call the short run, the medium run, or the long run? Versus apparel items like clothing, car sales, foreign exchange rates, procurement of airliners. If you are an airline, clearly you can't buy a new aeroplane at the aeroplane shop today. You need to put your order in, perhaps with Airbus or Boeing or some other aircraft manufacturer, and it's going to be, there'll be no doubt a backlog of orders, and it's probably going to be years before your airline actually takes delivery of those new airliners. Now, clearly there was a pandemic and suddenly no one was pretty much traveling anywhere. Air travel demand pretty much collapsed overnight. Clearly it has recovered significantly, particularly in the last 12 months, and airlines are having to look ahead. What do they anticipate will be demand for air travel, not next month, but years into the future? What kinds of aircraft would we like? Is it those with long ranges, but perhaps small seating capacity? Is it those larger aircraft that could perhaps have a shorter range? So anticipating what you think demand for air travel would be, these are going to be multi-billion-dollar decisions about to order a new Boeing Dreamliner or an Airbus A380, say. So depending on the industry or sector you are in and the kind of variable you're trying to forecast, the short, medium, and long run would inevitably vary accordingly. Now, I like visuals, of course, some live demonstrations to come. Trade-offs. I mentioned these earlier. Whenever you have a choice in life about anything, I mean, gosh, to do the Online Career Accelerator or not. I mean, in that sense, it's a binary decision. You can either sign up and devote the next 6 months of your life to pursuing this or not. And clearly, it's a trade-off. There are inevitably financial costs with doing the Career Accelerator. There's the time cost. Of course, perhaps the financial costs are more known. The study load, okay, we give expectations that on average, how many hours per week you might be expected to spend learning particular material. Now, inevitably, students or learners, career accelerator superstars will learn at different rates, and there'll be variation in the actual true number of hours per week that you spend studying. But we would simplify that and just come up with an expectation. So there are clearly some costs with the Career Accelerator, but there's going to be clearly some benefits, or shall we say expected benefits. Clearly, I'm sure all of you contemplating pursuing this program are doing this to literally advance your career. Now, of course, I can't promise you success going forward. Death and taxes are allegedly the only two certainties in life. But clearly, investing in your own human capital, in particular your quantitative skills, that should make you far more in demand, either by your current employers, or if you're looking to change sector or move to a competitor, hopefully achieve a higher salary elsewhere. So there's going to be trade-offs about doing this versus not. If you don't do it, you save the time and the money, but you're not going to be boosting your quantitative skill set, and hence are perhaps going to be a less attractive prospect for a promotion or getting a new job elsewhere. Now, in matters of modeling, again, you'll see this much more formally in the Career Accelerator. We face trade-offs. In this case, I'll pitch it in a forecasting sense between the costs of building a forecasting model. So this is the time effort put into this, how resource intensive it is in terms of data collection, but also costs due to the uncertainty attached with those forecasts. And inevitably, we'd always like the best of everything in life. Sadly, though, it's not a perfect or ideal world, and we're going to have to compromise. And so in matters of trade-off resolution, I will always say it's up to the individual or the team or company to resolve that trade-off, but I do want them clear what the trade-offs are between. What are the benefits and costs, and how you're going to weigh those up, and then make your appropriate decision. So I spoke about decomposing a time series as a learning outcome. Let's start to look at this. So terminology, a trend, the long run behavior of a time series. Seasonal effects. Now, when we talk about the seasons, I'm here in the UK. It's winter, it's mid-January, been pretty cold, very gusty, particularly this last weekend. Lots of people are having colds at the moment. I'm just recovering from one myself. Seasons, spring, summer, autumn, winter. That's the everyday how we may think of that term. However, depending on the frequency with which we collect data, we're not necessarily looking at things on a quarterly basis. Of course, we may be. Quarterly electricity demand, say, and so in the UK, we're going to have the heating on more in the winter months, the lights on more because the daylight hours are shorter. But maybe we collect data on a different frequency. Maybe it's daily data. And if I'm a supermarket, for example, clearly my seasons may be days of the week. So inevitably, the supermarkets tend to be a bit busier at the weekend, or maybe in the run-up to the weekend, when perhaps most households are doing perhaps their weekly shopping for that weekend. So seasonal effects would depend on the frequency with which we collect data. Cycles, business cycles, booms and busts, economic expansions, recessions, they do occur. Sadly, though, they are irregular in terms of their frequency, and frankly, it's very difficult to forecast how long an economic business cycle is going to last. So they are a real-world fact of life, but they are hard to directly model. So we're going to focus on trend and seasonality. There's also the random noise. These are literally the unpredictable things. These could be like a stock market crash, a pandemic, something which you hadn't foreseen, sometimes a nice thing, sometimes a nasty thing, and that will have an impact on our data series. So just to take by way of example, if you want a little bit of homework, optional homework, perhaps head to Statista, a great resource of various data sets. So here we have Netflix and their subscribers worldwide. So here we have quarterly data going from 2013 up till the Q3 2023. Now, I think you can clearly see that over time, Netflix subscribers has been increasing. Has it been increasing in a perfect straight line? No, but the overall trend is pretty clear. Of course, we can contextualize this. So if we look at, let's say, early 2020, when lockdowns began, a lot of people got bored very quickly because if you're stuck at home, what are you going to do? Well, let's be entertained. And maybe there's a bit of a big jump in Netflix subscribers. But then, is there some saturation point in 2022, a bit of a drop off from Q1 to Q2? So as of that moment in time, if we now go in our time machine, teleport back to Q2 2022, it has have we reached peak Netflix, and has this now saturated? Well, of course, we've seen since then there has been further growth. But this one's quite a nice time series in that the long run behavior is pretty clear, not perhaps too much evidence of seasonality. If we were to look, say the FTSE 100, let's just take max period here. So a financial data set, FTSE 100 formed in the 1984. Over time, clearly it's broadly gone up, but not in a straight line. That's your pandemic. Surprise, surprise, that's going to be your global financial crisis. So depending on what the time series is it financial data, Netflix subscribers, or other things, you would typically just need to look at the data series itself to see whether there's any evidence of a trend or seasonality. Because when you model a time series, you need to look at the big picture of the data set and look for what its key attributes are. So in the case of Netflix subscribers, treating as sort of having a linear model, it's not a perfect representation, but it's perhaps a better fit to the Netflix case than perhaps the FTSE 100. So we're going to look at the data series, see if we can find evidence of trend or seasonality, and then actually try and extrapolate that into the future. So I promised you a live demonstration. Good news, we are now at this future time point. So we're going to use Tableau, and I believe in the previous skills session, whenever that one ran, you had been introduced to Tableau. Well, you're going to get these slides later on. I'm actually just going to jump to Tableau itself and actually show you very quickly how we can come up with a, hopefully, a simple, but nonetheless quite effective forecasting model. Good news. In course 1 of your online career accelerator, should you, of course, decide to pursue the program, and I strongly encourage it, but again, I'm biased, you will see at Tableau, you'll get licensed versions of it, and will receive instruction in it in your first course. So Tableau is great for data visualization, bringing data to life. Now, I'm just going to show you one which has been prepared earlier, but we're going to quickly create our own, and time permitting, do a quick compare and contrast. So this is artificial data, but it resembles real world data. So our setting here is we have a fictitious, but again, reflecting reality, superstore that sells stuff, and it's got various products. So think of it like an e-commerce giant, so things like Amazon, Alibaba, etc. And we see here, this is the past, so it's like driving forwards, but looking out of the rear view mirror, looking at what has happened. And we see for different segments, so all products are classified as belonging either to a consumer, corporate, or home office segment. There's been some movement around. In this case, we have monthly data rather than quarterly, and there's been some fluctuations. On the far right-hand side, these are our forecasts, and note the ease with which we can digest the dashboard itself. Namely, we have the bold line in the middle there. That just represents the Tableau's forecasts of sales for the next 12 months. You will see some shading either side of those forecasts, which represent the errors or uncertainty attached to those forecasts. Now, just beware. some people see a forecast and assume incorrectly that this is the truth about where the world is headed. Clearly, all forecasts are uncertain. It's just that responsible people, responsible creators of and consumers of forecasts will be aware of the errors associated with them and report forecasts with some margin of forecasting error. Now, clearly, a good forecasting model is going to be one where the forecast error is sort of minimized. And indeed, we're briefly going to see how we might choose between some different forecasting models. So we'll just quickly create our own forecasts in Tableau. Again, you'll get full instruction of Tableau workings in course 1 of the Online Career Accelerator. So we'll have a data set, and of course, when you get the software, you can experiment with your own data, be it personal or professional, should you so choose. So we just need to decide what is it that we would like to plot. So remember, here on our forecast, we were looking at sales, and we were looking at this on a monthly frequency basis. So I'm going to find sales. There we go. I'm going to pop it here onto the so-called rows shelf. Now, this doesn't look very exciting yet. We've just got all sales, the sum of all sales, so just under £3 million worth. Clearly, with time series, we need some time element. In this case, we could look at the date when a specific order occurred. Now, we see here with our default one, we've got the sum of sales now broken down by calendar year, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. And I think it's pretty obvious it's clearly gone up over time, but not in a perfect straight line. Now, we can change the granularity of our time series. We could look at it on an annual basis. Maybe we wish to break it down perhaps by quarters. You know, if we're a publicly listed company, probably having, depending on which exchange we're listed on, maybe there are regulations we have to report our figures on a quarterly basis. Of course, if we're a private company, we're not subject to such a public exposure of having to reveal how good or bad our business is performing. So what do you care about? Figures annually, quarterly. Let's break it down to monthly. Now, you can see here, this one is a bit broken up. We don't have these nice, smooth lines, albeit not in a straight line. We don't have that here. So we'll just do a few setting changes in that. Initially, Tableau is looking at these lines of our time series variable in terms of these discrete units. And that's why there are these breaks between each particular quarter. In this case, I just want to put it all on a continuous basis, so join all of those points up. So now we have our line of time series of sales over time. But we saw on the pre-prepared one, this was broken down by segment. And the great thing about Tableau, it's very intuitive, and frankly, within 30 minutes to an hour of use, which you'll get all of this formal instruction, you'll be creating your own visualizations with ease. So if I want to look at this at a more granular level and break it down by individual segment, maybe we want to have some color as well. And color, and you'll look at color theory within the Online Career Accelerator. Of course, mindful that red-green color blindness is quite common. So note here, we don't have red and green. We have the blue, orange, red, and I would hope for everyone watching, you'll be able to distinguish those three particular colors. But we haven't got any forecasts yet. This is the past. This is us looking out of the rear view mirror. Now, you can be your own judge and jury to what extent you see any long-run behavior of those series. Do you see a trend? Is it increasing or decreasing over time? Do you see any seasonality? Now, note, with Netflix, we looked at quarterly data. I gave the supermarket example with daily data. So perhaps at weekends or maybe towards the weekend, supermarkets will likely be busier. There may be time of the day effects as well. When do you go to the supermarket? How busy is it? Do you shop when everyone else is shopping and it's just very hectic, or do you try to go there on the off-peak periods when you've got far more space and it's less chaotic? Here we have monthly. So maybe there are certain months when sales tend to be a bit higher. Public holidays, when do they occur? Well, clearly depending which country you are in and which specific public holidays tend to be celebrated. So in UK, December, clearly sales tend to be much higher then than perhaps at other times of the year. But depending on country and which holidays are celebrated, there may be certain months which tend to be busier than others. So we have no forecasts yet, but let's now quickly generate them. And I'll show you how quick and easy it is to do. So Tableau has an analytics feature. Now, to be fair, Tableau is primarily, I stress primarily, a data visualization tool. It is excellent if you're trying to bring data to life and try to find interesting trends, patterns, relationships between variables. However, if you wish to do, shall we say, serious analytics, Tableau might not be your primary tool of choice. And this is why the Online Career Accelerator, in LSE in collaboration with Fourth Rev, thanks for hosting this, you will be exposed to some programming languages, primarily Python. You'll see a little bit of something called R in course 3, such that if you have quite a bespoke analytical problem, then Tableau is not necessarily the right tool for the job. And that's why you'll be exposed to different software, programming languages within the Online Career Accelerator, each with a specific task in mind. But this is just really a little introduction to the field, so we will keep things simple. We wish to create a forecast. So the analytics capability, or the default or inbuilt analytics capability within Tableau, is fairly basic, but we are prioritizing simplicity over complexity here. So I simply want to add a forecast, and ta-da, there we go. We now have some forecasts. You saw them automatically appear. Now, if you're eagle-eyed, you might see that these look a little bit different to the forecasts that were in the pre-prepared version. So we're just going to drill down. Just going to right-click forecast and look at my forecast options. Again, you'll get the recording of this and some slides with some screenshots on it. So software such as Tableau will often have some default settings when you run something. And for a first pass analysis, maybe the defaults are perfectly acceptable just to get up and running. But then you may wish to override the default settings and fine tune things accordingly. So we were speaking about the lead time of forecasts. How far into the future does it make sense to make a forecast? Clearly, if you're forecasting sales 50 years into the future, who knows what the world will look like in 50 years' time? The uncertainties between now and half a century ahead are so huge, it would not make sense to forecast that far ahead. I think in this instance, perhaps forecasting for the next 12 months makes sense. Now, depending on the size of the screen that you're watching me on, it says automatic next 13 months. But of course, there are only 12 months in a year. So what it's done, as is often the case in the real world, that maybe your latest data observation is perhaps a provisional figure. And maybe that itself is subject to revision going forwards. So as of time of speaking, it's January 2024. We are currently in Q1 2024. So, or indeed, let's just say monthly data, January 2024. The month hasn't finished yet. So any sales we've already had in January is clearly not a final figure because we still got another, 9 days of trading to go. So what Tableau does as a default, it excludes the most recent observation because it's potentially a provisional figure, maybe not a final figure. But clearly you can override things as you deem appropriate. You now have automatic. So the default here is that Tableau just makes its own judgment about what it thinks is the best forecasting model. And you can see a little description here about creating on a monthly basis, and it's looking for potential seasonal patterns every 12 months. Now, again, in the Online Career Accelerator, you'll get to explore this yourselves in far greater depth. We can look at the time series. Do we see evidence of seasonality or not? If you don't see seasonality, you perhaps want a model which does not include seasonality. But maybe you want to come up with a custom-made model. And you can decide to what extent you see evidence of a trend or seasonality, and whether you want to consider these in a so-called additive way, literally a trend contribution to sales, a seasonal contribution to sales, and literally add them together. Or maybe you want to look at things in a multiplicative setting, whereby it's not just done in an additive way, it's done sort of proportionally given the level of the series. So you can see, you saw in real time how, as we change the specifics of the forecasting model, how those forecasts themselves changed. So there's not one right way of doing this. There are multiple ways, and clearly we would want some means of determining the best way. Conscious of time, just give me perhaps 5 more minutes, and we'll go to Q&A. So I want to show you briefly how we might evaluate how good or poor a forecasting model is. Prediction intervals. For those who did some stats at uni once upon a time, I'm sure you remember your 95% confidence intervals. Well, 95%, we can convert here to prediction intervals, but we can change what level of sort of predictive accuracy we might be prepared to tolerate. 90, 95, 99 being common ones. Inevitably, though, a trade-off. If we have a higher percentage here, that sounds a good thing. Rather have a 99% prediction interval than perhaps a 95 or 90% one, but it's perhaps quite subtle in this example. The width of those error bars changes accordingly. We want the error bars to be as short as possible, and good, but to get that, other things equal, we need to reduce this percentage. So inevitably there are trade-offs. So we can see very quickly Tableau looks at the past, looks for patterns, trends, and or seasonality, and then extrapolates those into the future. And very quickly, describing forecasts. Okay, just make this a little bit bigger. So note, I've not used a single equation or formula in generating these. I was just pointing and clicking, dragging and dropping stuff in the on the Tableau at Canvas. But now we might want to look in a little bit more detail about the structure of the forecasts themselves. So it gives some summaries of these, to what extent it's found evidence of trend or seasonality. We have these sort of quality indicators, and Tableau actually classifies its forecast to, at a more qualitative sense, but in a ranked order, about how good or poor it feels the quality forecasts are. Now, what I'm going to do is actually jump back to the previous forecasts here, the pre-made ones. Describe forecasts. There we go. There we go. So you can see this one does have some seasonal component, because we did experiment with the our custom-made one about whether we wanted to have seasonality in there, yes or no. So we've got different forecasting models here, and so now we have a choice between, let's say, these ones and the ones I've created. So under this models tab, that's perhaps our last main point for now. We need some metric, some way to judge the predictive accuracy of forecasts. Now, each column here, these are just acronyms and perhaps mean nothing to you at this stage. Don't panic. In the slides, which I believe will be sent on to you, you'll see formulae for these. We'll just look at them at a high level now. These are just different alternative ways of judging the quality of a forecast or forecasting model. So when you have a choice of models, you clearly want the best model. If you want the best of anything, you need to be clear in what sense is something the best. Now, in matters of forecasting, it's about the accuracy, or shall we say the error, the forecast error. And we clearly like the forecast error to be as small as possible. So actually, I'm just going to jump to the slides. I just want to, this one here. So my personal favorite is this thing called root mean squared error, RMSE. And you can see it's reported here for this particular forecasting model. We see a number, numerical values. It's not magic where they come from. There has to be a formula behind it. Now, this is simply an average, a mean. And you will all be familiar with what a mean is. You add stuff up divided by the number of things you've got. It's just that, what are we taking an average of? Well, in sort of a retrospective way, we can look at the actual observed value in the past versus what this model historically would have forecast for that specific time period. So we've got the actual versus the retrospective forecast. And then we can see with this benefit of hindsight, how good or bad, how right or wrong our forecasting model was. Now, clearly, some of these forecast errors will be positive, some will be negative. Have we sort of overestimated what sales would be or underestimated? Now, clearly, depending on what you're using this for, getting something wrong to the upside or downside, there may be an asymmetry that you may deem one is more serious than another. But as a very simple metric, we can simply look at squaring those forecast errors. I'm sure many of you will recognize this as the summation, adding stuff up. So we're simply adding up all of those historic forecast errors squared, and then dividing by the number we have. So capital T for time series data, T for time, is just often used to indicate the number of observations. And now we're just taking the root, literally the square root of the average, the mean of the squared errors. So in a perfect world, all of our retrospective forecasts would have been equal to the true values, in which case all of those forecast errors would have been 0. 0 squared is 0, and the average of all of those zeros would, of course, be 0. So we would like the root mean squared error to be as small as possible. And at your leisure, I know we have very limited time in the slides, which you'll get, some alternative quality metrics. And I just give little brief explanations about why we may favor one over another. So they all are trying to achieve the same thing, but they take a different approach to actually coming up with this value. So let me just take the root mean squared error. It's my personal favorite. So if we're looking at the consumer or corporate or home office. So with this forecasting model, let me just take a quick screen shot of this. Hopefully this is working. There we go. And now we're going to compare and contrast with the forecasts that I produced over here. Okay, so let me just describe forecasts, go on to models. There we go. There we go. Ah, fantastic. Great stuff. So you can see here we have examples of two different forecasting models. They differ in terms of the additive versus multiplicative way of treating the trends and seasonality. And if we take the consumer segment by way of example, with the model I came up with, the average, literally mean, squared error, root mean squared error, 10,375 versus, so I can highlight it there, 7,100 with the other forecasting model. So errors are bad. Root mean squared error, we want to make it as small as possible. So if we were to compare these two different forecasting models, then clearly it's this one, which is better for the consumer segment. But wait a minute. Look at the corporate sector, 6,374 versus the 5,696 here. So whether we use an additive or multiplicative model, don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. The multiplicative seems to do a better job on average on a root mean squared error basis for the forecast for the corporate segment versus the additive model, whereas the additive model is better for both the consumer and that home office segment. Now, these are just two examples of forecasting models. Clearly, they are not collectively exhaustive, but already you can see how we can have a simple metric to compare the relative performance of different forecasting models. So I think we've got about technically 6 minutes left, but I may overrun by 2 or 3 minutes, but stay tuned. Special offer coming. It's not really a special offer. It's a reward rather than a special offer. So just very quickly, Q&A. I see a couple of Qs in the Q&A, so let me very quickly run through them. Are the cycles always regarded long run, i.e. 8 to 10 years? Are there shorter cycles? Great question. All questions are great. So cycles, thinking about business cycles, economic booms and busts, expansions, contractions, they are always irregular in terms of their frequency as well as their severity, the height, if you like, of those peaks and troughs. Now, for economic, so business cycles, these are likely to be usually in lasting several months or years. Technically, an economist would define a recession as 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. But even then, it gets a little bit complicated because it's based on GDP. And actually, any GDP figures you can find for your home country or any countries you wish to compare, those themselves are just estimates. They're of the past, but clearly there's an underground economy in pretty much all countries. Not all economic activity is officially reported. So these GDP figures themselves are estimates, which tend to be historically revised. And perhaps a little homework exercise, should you be interested, you may wish to perhaps pick for your own country, look at, just do a quick internet search for perhaps GDP revisions. I'll take the UK. There's always a reporting lag because it takes a while to compile the official statistics and then give a GDP figure. But let's say for Q4 2023, there'll perhaps be a figure. I'm not sure if it's been released yet, but almost certainly in the future, that historic figure will be revised. And depending whether we are technically in a recession or not, historic revisions may then change when an economy truly was in a recession or not. So business cycles, they're very problematic. They don't occur with this nice regular periodicity. So they are very complicated to model directly. And you'll note that's why Tableau did not have cycles in there. It focused on trend, long-run behavior, and seasonality. Second question, Ibrahim, thanks for joining. Which forecasting model will be suitable for food restaurant sales? So restaurants. Let's imagine it was 2019, okay? And let's say you own a restaurant chain and you were trying to, in 2019, forecast your sales into 2020. Clearly, in 2019, I very much doubt you expected a pandemic to occur in 2020. Everyone's locked down, and clearly, you were not allowed to leave your house, certainly in the UK, and therefore, restaurants, many obviously were closed or went out of business. Okay, maybe some did some home delivery, but clearly not a perfect substitute for normal operations. Now, thankfully, pandemics are quite rare, and hopefully we're not going to have another one for some time. I say hopefully, I can't predict the future, nor can you. We can have a go, and with some uncertainty, of course. But with restaurants, clearly there's going to be some seasonal effects. I mean, I'll take UK, for example. When do people go out to eat for a meal? Is it more likely to be at the weekends, maybe over public holidays? I mean, today's Monday. I'd imagine restaurants Monday evening in central London, obviously there'll be a few diners, but maybe not as busy as maybe on a Friday or Saturday at night. Clearly, if your restaurant is serving a particular cuisine, does that become more in or out of fashion? Of course, you would look historically, see if you see any patterns, long run, hopefully increase in patronage, number of diners, but you will see historically whether or when you have your more busier periods. Is it certain times of the day? Is it certain days of the week? Or even certain weeks or months of the year? So as with our Netflix and supermarket examples, you would look at the past data series and see to what extent you can see evidence of trend or seasonality. And the more that you visually see it, then clearly you would wish to incorporate that into a simple forecasting model. One final question, perhaps I'll quickly take that one, then I'll reveal your special offer. Well, reward, not special offer. Can you, in short, I will try, give an explanation or materials to understand why measures tend to be squared? So that root means squared error. So we saw a little formula that the forecast error will be in a retrospective way. So we're looking at if we use this model in the past, how accurate would it have been? And we're using this as hopefully an indicator that if it performed well historically, we are hoping the predicted performance continues unchanged in the future. Clearly, that's an assumption, and it may not hold in practice, but we have no future data yet, so this is better than nothing. So for the squaring itself, clearly, if the past value was actually this, if I forecast this value, I've got a positive forecast error. I've been over optimistic in that forecast versus if I had forecast down here, then I've got a negative error. So by squaring, whether the error was positive or negative, depending on which way round wrong we were, by squaring you remove all of the sign effect because everything then becomes positive. Now, of course, depending on application, is it better or less bad? All errors are arguably bad. It's then a matter on a relative basis. Is it better to or less bad to over or under predict something? So then, of course, you might say that maybe the sign actually does matter, but often, always be exceptions, the sign won't matter. So squaring things, all differences, be they positive or negative, everything then becomes positive. With squaring it, the root mean squared error. The squaring basically imposes a greater penalty for a large forecast error. So do we care about the sign, but also do we care about the magnitude of being wrong? If we're forecasting temperature, say, for the weather. If the weather forecast is wrong by 1 or 2 degrees, in a practical sense, who cares? What you wear will not differ much if the temperature was 1 or 2 degrees warmer or colder than you thought. If, though, it was out by 20 degrees in either direction, then that big forecast error, that magnitude, would be far more consequential. So whether one squares things or looks at absolute errors, that would depend on to what extent you felt large errors, how serious are they? And if you feel they are extremely serious given your application, then you would perhaps wish to have or pay a greater penalty for that. And that's why the root mean squared error does this quite nicely by penalizing the big errors more heavily, whereas something like the mean absolute error doesn't. So it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. And it's up to you to make your own judgment call about which you feel is the most suitable measure. And sadly, there's typically never one single right answer. Of course, one has to make a decision in practice, be aware of what the pros and cons are, and then be able to justify your particular choice. And just before I reveal the offer, that's a closing comment. If you pursue this online career accelerator, you'll look at analyzing lots of different problems and be shown many different ways of doing so. And ultimately, it will be down to you or for your employer project as a group effort to decide which is the best thing to do. Again, best needs to be qualified. Is it best in terms of accuracy? Is it best in terms of simplicity, speed, how quick and easy it is to do, or quick and easy to implement or explain? And ultimately, you will need to make a judgment call. So there's a qualitative dimension to this as well. What matters, though, is that you are able to robustly justify and defend your particular choice. So communication skills, I think, are vital for any budding data analyst. And indeed, there's a strong emphasis on soft skills and communication skills development in the Online Career Accelerator. It's not just about crunching the numbers. You do need to be able to convey your findings in simple, easy to understand terms.